The dust is kicking up from sun-baked earth. On one side, a massive horde of Gallic warriors, bodies painted, voices a deafening, terrifying roar. They are a chaotic wave of pure energy, ready to crash. On the other side, a line of silent crimson-clad figures. They don't shout, they don't chant. The only sounds are the rhythmic clink of metal, the soft creak of leather sandals, and the synchronized thud of thousands of feet hitting the ground as one. These are the legions of Rome, an army that conquered the known world, often facing enemies who were more numerous, who fought with a special kind of ferocity that comes from defending your own home, and who were masters of their own terrain. The Gauls were famous for their terrifying charges. Germanic tribes had their Beredus, a war chant that grew from a murmur to a thunderous roar, amplified by their shields to shatter an enemy's nerve. And yet, Rome crushed them all. So, how'd they do it? Have you ever wondered how a military from a single city managed to dominate a world of such diverse and formidable opponents? It wasn't just about better steel, stronger armor, or even brilliant battlefield tactics. It was a weapon that was far more insidious, far more effective, and far more terrifying. Psychological warfare. Rome's empire wasn't just built on stone and roads, it was constructed inside the minds of its enemies. The legions conquered not just with the sword, but with cunning manipulation designed to break their enemies from within, before the first javelin was ever thrown. So, let's pull back the curtain on the sinister messages, the grand deceptions, and the calculated acts of terror that allowed Rome to mentally dominate the ancient world. These aren't the tactics you learned about in school. This is the story of how mind tricks built an empire. Imagine you're a warrior in a British tribe. Your queen, Boudica, has united your people in a massive uprising against the Roman invaders. You and your comrades number in the tens of thousands a massive force, brimming with confidence. You've even brought your families in wagons to witness the great victory you're so sure is coming. As you advance, you shout, you scream, you beat your shields, a cacophony of righteous fury meant to shatter the morale of the few Romans you see before you. But they don't react. They just stand there, silent, a disciplined, unmoving wall of red. The silence is unnatural. It's unnerving. It projects a cold, machine-like confidence that your chaotic noise can't seem to penetrate. That silence is a weapon. And just as you get closer, wondering what's happening, the Roman line suddenly erupts. Not with a disorganized scream, but with a single, fierce battle cry. A coordinated volley of heavy javelins, and a disciplined charge that smashes into your line like a tidal wave. The shock is total. The whiplash from eerie quiet to explosive violence is a psychological blow your army will never recover from. This is the power of a Roman mind trick, and it's just the beginning. In the chaotic symphony of ancient warfare, where noise was a primary tool of intimidation, the Romans discovered the profound psychological power of its opposite. Most of their adversaries, from the Gauls to the Germanic tribes, relied on ferocious war cries to build their own courage and terrorize opponents. This was the normal language of the battlefield, a contest of who could sound the most terrifying. The Romans chose to speak a different language. By marching and forming up in disciplined silence, they presented a deeply unsettling paradox. An army that wasn't emotional, not driven by rage or fear, seemed inhuman, like a machine built for death. This wasn't just a preference, it was a calculated strategy. Silence allowed for crystal-clear communication through horns like the tuba and the cornule, or visual standards held high. It made complex maneuvers like the famous testudo formation possible, where soldiers had to move in perfect concert. Any shouted orders would be lost in the din of battle, but the clear blast of a horn could be heard and understood instantly. The psychological effect on the enemy was devastating. A silent advance was an expression of supreme confidence. It suggested the Roman soldiers were so well trained, so sure of victory, that they didn't need the emotional crutch of a war cry. It created a gnawing anxiety in the opposing ranks. It made them question everything. If their terrifying screams had no effect, what would? The historian Tacitus gives us the most vivid account of this during Boudica's revolt in 61 AD. The Britons, vastly outnumbering the Romans, advanced with loud shouts and war cries. The Romans waited in a narrow defile, holding their ground in that unnerving silence. They let the Britons get close, into the perfect range for their heavy javelins. The pillar, then, at the perfect moment, the silence was shattered by a unified Roman war cry and a devastating volley. The sudden transition from absolute quiet to coordinated violence was a masterstroke. It maximized the shock and awe of their attack, turning the Britons' own momentum against them. The Britons expected a battle of passion and fury. What they got was a cold, calculating execution. They broke, and the rout was catastrophic. Rome understood that true terror doesn't always roar. Sometimes, it's the quiet confidence of an army that knows it's about to kill you, and doesn't need to waste its breath telling you so. Part 2. Engineering Terror. The siege as theater. Roman warfare wasn't just fought with soldiers, it was fought with shovels, axes, and an unmatched genius for engineering. But Roman engineering wasn't just practical, it was psychological theater. The best example of this has to be their approach to siege warfare, which was less a battle and more a structured contest of morale. The ultimate expression of this was the siege of Alesia in 52 BC. Here was the problem for Julius Caesar. He had the charismatic Gallic leader Vercingetorix and about 80,000 of his warriors cornered inside the hilltop fortress of Alesia. But Caesar was in a tight spot. He was deep in hostile territory, and he knew a massive Gallic relief army, which ancient sources claimed numbered in the hundreds of thousands, was on its way to attack his rear. A conventional siege was out of the question. He was about to be caught between a hammer and an anvil. Caesar's solution was audacious, bordering on insane. He decided to besiege the Gauls, while simultaneously building a fortress to defend against the other Gallic army. He built two massive lines of fortifications. The first, a wall of circumvallation, was an 11-mile ring facing inward to trap Vercingetorix. This was a complex series of trenches, ramparts, watchtowers, and hidden traps like pits with sharpened stakes. But it was the second wall, the 13-mile-long contravallation facing outward, that was the real masterpiece of psychological terror. In just a few weeks, Caesar's legions, outnumbered and under immense pressure, had built a massive, self-contained military monstrosity in the heart of Gaul. Now, imagine you're one of the Gallic warriors inside Alesia. Day after day, you watch this impossible structure rise from the earth. Every tower, every ditch, is a statement. It doesn't just say, you're trapped. It says, we are inevitable. We can build a city faster than you can be rescued. It was a demonstration of Roman organization and discipline meant to crush the spirit. As food inside Alesia grew scarce, the situation became so desperate that the Gauls expelled their own women and children, hoping Caesar would let them pass. Caesar refused. He posted guards and forced them into the no man's land between the town and his inner wall to starve. It was an act of supreme cruelty, but it served a terrifying purpose. For the defenders on the walls and the arriving relief army, the sight of these suffering people was a constant, grim reminder of the price of resistance. When the Gallic relief force finally arrived, they weren't just attacking a Roman army, they were attacking a fortress. The sheer scale of Caesar's works confounded them. Their attacks were repelled, and eventually, the massive relief army, demoralized and unable to break through, simply melted away. Seeing their last hope vanish, the starving defenders of Alesia surrendered. Vercingetorix was handed over to Caesar, and Gallic independence was over. Alesia wasn't just a military victory, it was a triumph of psychological engineering. Caesar didn't just defeat the Gauls, he outbuilt them, outorganized them, and broke their will by making Roman victory look like a law of nature, written in earth and timber. If you're finding this look into the dark arts of Roman psychology as fascinating as we do, and you think history is more than just dates and battles, then do us a favor and hit that subscribe button. We pull back the curtain on secrets and strategies they do unteach you in school every single week. And let us know in the comments, if you were a Gallic warrior watching Caesar's double wall go up, would you have held on to hope, or would the sheer scale of it have broken your spirit? Let's get the discussion going. Now, back to the mind games. Part 3, the art of deception, lying their way to victory. While Rome is famous for its discipline, its legions were also masters of the exact opposite: cunning, misdirection, and outright deception. War, for the Romans, was no gentleman's game. It was a contest to be won by any means necessary, and a good lie was as valuable a weapon as a sword. They understood that all warfare is based on deception. One of the most common tricks was the feigned retreat. This tactic required incredible discipline, as soldiers had to convincingly pretend to be panicked and routed, all while staying in perfect order to turn and strike at the decisive moment. The goal was to lure an overconfident enemy out of a strong position, stretch their lines thin, and lead them into a pre-planned kill zone. Beyond battlefield tricks, Roman generals would spread rumors of phantom legions on the march, lighting extra campfires at night to make their force look bigger than it was. They'd even leave behind fake tracks and discarded gear to make an enemy panic and flee before a battle was even fought. It was war by illusion. But perhaps the most powerful form of deception was diplomatic. Roman ambassadors were known for an aggressive, almost rude negotiating style. dictating terms to foreign kings in their own courts. This was a psychological power move, projecting an aura of such unshakable confidence that it could intimidate a rival into submission. There's a famous story of a Roman general besieging a Spanish town. When a deputation from the town boasted they had enough supplies for 10 years, the general simply replied, "Then we'll conquer you in the 11th year." The town surrendered. The message was clear. Roman resolve was infinite. Julius Caesar was a particularly brilliant practitioner of these arts. Throughout his campaigns, he often framed his actions not as naked conquest but as necessary defensive measures. He exaggerated threats to justify military intervention, skillfully manipulating politics back in Rome to cast himself as the protector of the Republic, all while expanding its borders and his own power. He wasn't just fighting a war on the battlefield. He was fighting and winning a war of information. The Romans knew that a victory won through deception was often cleaner and cheaper than one won by brute force. By hacking their enemies' perception of reality, they could lead them into fatal errors, shatter their alliances, and break their will to fight. Part 4. The propaganda machine controlling the narrative for Rome. The battle was only half the war. The other half was fought far from the front lines in the hearts and minds of its own citizens, its allies, and its conquered subjects. Rome was a master of propaganda, understanding that controlling the narrative was just as important as winning the conflict. A war had to be seen as a Balaam iustum, a just war declared for a righteous cause, giving them the moral high ground and solidifying support at home. Generals like Julius Caesar were not just commanders, they were master storytellers. His commentaries on the Gallic War is one of the most brilliant pieces of military propaganda ever written. On the surface, it's a straightforward account of his campaigns, but underneath, it's a carefully crafted narrative designed to justify his actions and glorify his achievements. In his telling, Caesar is always the reluctant warrior, forced to act to protect Roman allies or preempt a barbarian threat. He was imprinting his own version of history on the world. This control extended to the visual realm. The Roman triumph wasn't just a victory parade, it was a propaganda spectacle designed to awe the populace and reinforce Roman military supremacy. The victorious general would ride in a chariot, his face painted red to resemble Jupiter. The procession included his legions, captured enemy leaders in chains, and wagons piled high with the spoils of war. Coinage was another powerful tool. After the First Jewish-Roman War, Emperor Vespasian issued coins with his profile on one side, and on the other, a mourning woman symbolizing Judea sitting beneath a Roman trophy. The message, spread to every corner of the empire through commerce, was simple and brutal. Judea is defeated. Rome is triumphant. It both reassured Romans and intimidated anyone else thinking of revolt. Even enemy leaders were props in this grand theater. After his surrender at Alesia, Vercingetorix was held prisoner for several years, only to be paraded through Rome in Caesar's triumph before being ceremonially executed. His long, humiliating journey was a deliberate performance, a living symbol of the consequences of defying Rome. By mastering propaganda, Rome ensured its power was not just a military fact, but a universally accepted truth. They didn't just tell the story of their victories, they made those victories seem glorious, just, and inevitable. Part 5. The Cult of Inevitability. Divine right to rule. To be a Roman was to believe you were special, that your city was destined by the gods to rule the world. This wasn't just patriotism, it was a deep-seated, state-sponsored religious conviction that served as another powerful psychological weapon. The Romans created a cult of inevitability, the idea that their victory was a matter of divine will. Roman religion was practical and contractual, based on the principle of do ut de. I give, so that you might give. Before a campaign, generals would perform elaborate public rituals, promising the gods a share of the spoils in exchange for their favor. Priests known as augurs would take the auspices, interpreting divine will by observing things like the flight patterns of birds. A favorable omen could dramatically boost the morale of the legions, convincing them the gods were on their side. And they didn't just focus on their own gods. The Romans practiced a ritual called the evocatio, where they would formally invite an enemy's deity to abandon their city and take up residence in Rome, promising them better temples and more fervent worship. This was psychological warfare aimed at demoralizing an enemy by suggesting that even their own gods had defected to the winning side. Generals skillfully wove this divine narrative into their personal brands. Julius Caesar claimed to be a descendant of the goddess Venus. His successor, Augustus, went even further, fostering an imperial cult that essentially deified the emperor's authority. This tied the stability of the empire directly to the divine favor of its ruler, making rebellion not just a political act, but an act of impiety. For a Roman legionary, this meant they were fighting not just for a general, but for the cosmic order of the universe. For Rome's enemies, this was incredibly intimidating. They weren't just facing an army, they were facing a people who believed their victory was preordained. This cult of inevitability was a self-fulfilling prophecy. By believing they were destined to win, the Romans fought with a confidence that often ensured they did. Their message to those who stood in their way was terrifying. You aren't just fighting the legions of Rome. You are fighting against destiny itself. Part 6. Breaking the Spirit. The logic of cruelty. Roman power wasn't built on clever tricks alone. It was also built on a foundation of calculated, systematic terror. The Romans understood that fear was a powerful tool for control, and they were masters at wielding it. Their punishments weren't just retribution, they were public spectacles designed to break the will of their enemies and serve as a horrifying warning. Crucifixion is the most infamous example. It was a slow, agonizing, public death designed for maximum humiliation and deterrence. After Spartacus's revolt was crushed, 6,000 of his followers were crucified along the Appian Way, the main road into Rome. For miles, travelers were confronted by this forest of crucisa, gruesome message from the state. This is the fate of rebels. This logic of cruelty was even turned inward on their own legions, in the form of decimation. The term itself, from the Latin for removal of a tenth, describes the brutal practice of punishing a unit for cowardice by executing 1 in every 10 of its soldiers. The victims were chosen by lot, and in a final, horrifying twist, the condemned man was beaten or stoned to death, not by an executioner but by the other 9 men from his own group. Decimation was a rare and extreme measure, but its psychological impact was immense. It forced soldiers to become complicit in the punishment, creating a profound sense of shared trauma. Generals like Marcus Licinius Crassus used it during the war against Spartacus to restore discipline in legions that had fled from battle. The message was brutally clear. The legion is a single entity. The failure of one is the failure of all, and Roman soldiers should fear their commanders even more than they feared the enemy. This calculated use of terror was a cornerstone of Roman control. They knew that while you could conquer territory with an army, you controlled a population with fear. The destruction of cities like Carthage was so complete, it gave rise to the legend that the Romans sowed the fields with salt to ensure nothing would ever grow there again, a story that, while likely a myth, speaks volumes about their reputation for absolute destruction. By making examples, the Romans ensured that the very idea of resistance became synonymous with unimaginable suffering. Section 7. Divide et impera, turning enemies against each other. Perhaps the most sophisticated and enduring of Rome's psychological strategies was the principle of divide et impera, divide and conquer. The Romans were masters of political manipulation, recognizing that a united enemy was the greatest threat. Their goal was often not to defeat their enemies in one big battle, but to dismantle their alliances, foster their rivalries, and turn them against one another until they were just a collection of weakened factions that could be picked off one by one. This strategy was incredibly effective in places like Gaul, which wasn't a single nation but a complex patchwork of hundreds of tribes, each with its own history of alliances and feuds. Julius Caesar, a master of this art, exploited these divisions with surgical precision. He'd form a temporary alliance with one tribe, offering them Roman favor to help him fight another. He presented himself as a mediator in their disputes, all while deepening the cracks in their relationships. The Roman method was systematic. They would enter a region and meticulously gather intelligence on the local political landscape. Who were the traditional enemies? Which leader was ambitious? Armed with this knowledge, they could offer support, money, or military aid to one side, fanning the flames of existing conflicts. This created an environment where Gallic tribes were more focused on fighting each other than on the Roman invaders. The system for managing conquered territories was also a form of psychological division. The Romans broke up existing confederations. They didn't treat every conquered group the same. Some were granted full or partial Roman citizenship, while others were made allies who were required to supply troops for the Roman army. This created a hierarchy of status and privilege, giving some communities a vested interest in the Roman system while leaving others resentful. To rebel meant not only fighting Rome, but also fighting your neighbors, who now benefited from Roman rule. When it worked, this strategy was devastatingly effective. It allowed a relatively small Roman force to control vast territories by leveraging the strength of their enemies against themselves. It was the ultimate mind trick, one that allowed Rome to build an empire not just by conquering its enemies, but by convincing them to break themselves. Conclusion: from the unnerving silence of a legion on the march to the grand, intimidating theater of a siege, from the subtle lies of diplomats to the brutal spectacle of a crucifixion, the story of Rome's rise is inseparable from its mastery of the human mind. They weaponized silence to project an aura of inhuman discipline. They used their engineering genius at sieges like Alesia not just to trap armies, but to crush the hope of entire nations. They deployed deception and propaganda to control the story, justifying their wars and solidifying their power. They cultivated a belief in their own divine destiny, making their victories seem preordained, and they used calculated terror and the cynical strategy of divide and conquer to break empires from within. The Roman Empire didn't dominate for 1,000 years by brute force alone. They were not just warriors, they were architects of fear, engineers of morale, and masters of perception. They understood that the most important battlefield is the 6 inches of space between an enemy's ears. They knew an army that has lost its will to fight is already defeated, no matter its size. The swords and shields are now relics in museums. The empire has long since fallen, but the lessons from their psychological playbook endure, a chilling testament to the fact that the most powerful weapon in any conflict is the ability to understand, manipulate, and ultimately break the mind of your opponent. Rome didn't just conquer the world, they outsmarted it, and in doing so, they didn't just win wars, they changed how wars were fought forever.